Mesopotamia is considered the cradle of the first great civilizations. Among them are the Sumerians, who created well-organized kingdoms at the beginning of the Bronze Age. Obviously, at that time, human beings did not only live in Mesopotamia. They were in much of the globe, and most lived as nomads or in small villages. Some tribes migrated to North Africa in about 5500 BC, where they created villages and spread out along the Nile Valley. More precisely, in the regions now known as Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. The region was chosen for the existence of the famous Nile River. Besides being the most extensive river in the world, it was also responsible for the development of Egyptian culture. The ancient Egyptians called the Nile River Iteru, meaning Great River. They considered it a gift from the gods to all living beings. Every year, the Nile River has periods of high tide, irrigating the soil around it. The debris makes the land dark and fertile, and makes it possible to farm and graze rural animals. One of the names that the Egyptians used to refer to their land was Kemet, a term that can be translated as Black Earth, underlining the importance of fertility in the soil. The most prominent region is the delta of the Nile, where the river is divided into several branches, flowing into the Mediterranean Sea, where the largest number of settlements are. As with the Mesopotamian peoples, the dominance of agriculture was the main stimulus to boost trade and cultural development of the early Egyptians. As time went by, settlements became independent cities. Soon, the first rulers began to emerge, who declared themselves sovereign kings of their territories. In 3100 BC, a king of Upper Egypt began a military campaign against the other cities. The identity of this king is discussed among historians. Archaeological records indicate the existence of a semi-legendary king who, according to the beliefs at the time, would be a descendant of Horus. This mysterious king was probably known by the name of Narmer or Menes. There are strong indications that Narmer would be the name used. More complete studies indicate that Menes was an honorary title, which means he who perseveres. Narmer was successful in his campaign and unified the people of Lower and Upper Egypt under his command. He was the first pharaoh of Egypt. Narmer began the first Egyptian dynasties. This was followed by 30 dynasties over the centuries. The city of Memphis was founded by Narmer. For a long time, it was the capital of ancient Egypt, due to its geographical location, which guaranteed a strategic control point in Egyptian territory. The city had a port on the banks of the Nile River, where factories and workshops are built, producing ceramic jars, clothes, or dyes that were transported to the neighboring cities by boats along the river. Even in this period of their history, the Egyptians already had conflicts with the neighboring peoples. For example, some Nubian and Lebanese tribes who did not accept the dominant power of the Egyptians in most fertile territories. These tribes constantly rebelled against the Egyptians and attacked smaller villages and cities, provoking violent fighting and making it difficult to distribute goods throughout the region. It is possible that Pharaoh Narmer married Nithotep, a princess from North Africa. The marriage would have political objectives to appease disputes on Egyptian territory. Nithotep was the first queen of Egypt. Perhaps she was the first female pharaoh after Narmer's death. If so, she was the first woman in history to rule a dynasty. Nithotep's name was found in several places, such as tombstones and sacred objects. This underlines its importance as co-founder of the first dynasty. She is the oldest queen of ancient Egypt, whose name is known by historians. During the great history of ancient Egypt, the pharaohs played a more important role than traditional figure attributed to kings and emperors. The Egyptians considered us sacred beings to the Egyptians. According to the beliefs of the time, the pharaohs had inherited divine blood. They were descendants of Horus, and for that reason, only those who belonged to that same lineage were entitled to the throne. This explains why some women have taken over throughout Egyptian history. In contemporary peoples, only men had the right to rule, but the Egyptians always chose a woman with divine blood over a man without that trait. The pharaohs were not only in charge of governing, they were also the supreme commanders of the army, the highest magistrates, and the highest priests. The pharaoh was the human figure closest to the gods. Despite all the benefits available to the pharaohs, their lives were not particularly easy. Some took on the burden of governance of a nation before the age of 12. the heir to the royal throne was prepared from childhood to fill the position. He had to learn military tactics, the history of kingdoms, and military conquests. He also had to learn to read, write, and memorize religious rites. Despite the authority of the pharaohs, they rarely remained in power for long. Their reign was often interrupted by invaders or coups. To prolong the reign of the pharaohs, every year ritualistic festivals took place, the Opet festivals. The objective was to rejuvenate the pharaoh and his bond with the gods. When a pharaoh was able to remain in power for about 30 years, a great party was organized to exalt his reign. At death, he was honored with parties, songs, and rituals of passage to the other world. Around 2686 BC, the phase known as the Ancient Empire, also known as the Pyramid Age, began. In this period, Egypt was already established as an empire, having commercial relations with the Lebanese, Palestinian, and Mesopotamian peoples. Egypt had become a land of great riches. During the Ancient Empire, there were great artistic and architectural breakthroughs. The paintings that adorned the temples and palaces were made with great skill, whose proportions were calculated with high precision. The dye came from the extract of plants and minerals. Insects and animal blood were even used to achieve more vivid colors. As a result, many paintings maintain their colors and splendor today. The paintings could represent from everyday life to great events, such as bountiful harvests, the crowning of pharaohs, or natural disasters. The gods and sacred rituals were prominent in the artistic representations. Many of the most famous stories of the Egyptian pantheon were told through paintings and carvings of palace walls and tombs. In the economy, all production was accounted for and recorded, which enabled a more accurate allocation of resources. Government officials collected taxes, recruited peasants to work on crops or in construction, and headed the legal system, commanding patrols of soldiers and prosecuting crimes. During the Ancient Empire, the military area also progressed. The soldiers already had breastplates made of wool or leather, shields made of wood and covered with leather, and the iconic Khopesh sword, also of this period. Around 2200 BC, there was a great period of drought in Egypt, which lasted 140 years. It caused hunger in the population and a decline in economic and social power. Instability ravaged Egypt, and the pharaoh's government lost control of his territories. Some provinces further away from the capital revolted and declared independence. The leaders of the rebel provinces stopped paying taxes to the central government and began to enrich their own coffers. In the end, a kind of mafia leader was born, as they hired criminals and deserters as personal protectors. Two groups stood out. One commanded Lower Egypt, from the city of Heracleopolis, and the other commanded Upper Egypt, from the city of Thebes. Around 2055 BC, the forces of Thebes, commanded by Mentuhotep II, defeated the rulers of Heracleopolis, unifying Egypt again and beginning the period of the Middle Empire. The sands of Egypt hold secrets and stories that awaken our imagination and will to unravel the past of one of the greatest civilizations in history. After the difficult times of the Ancient Empire, the Egyptians managed to recover their ancient territories and trade routes. It was the beginning of a new era of prosperity. This new phase in Egyptian history is known as the Middle Empire, between 2050 BC and 1710 BC. After re-establishing military control in Egypt, the economy had to recover. New irrigation systems were built, besides new monuments to the gods. Pharaoh Mentuhotep II began a military campaign to conquer Nubia, a region rich in gold and precious jewelry, and very lucrative for the debilitated Egyptian coffers. The fight against the Nubians lasted many years, and, despite their insistence, the Egyptians were unable to totally subjugate their opponents, proving the great military capability of the African tribes. Mentuhotep II died after reigning for 51 years. He was buried together with his 6 wives in a funeral complex in Deir el-Bahari. After Egypt regained its financial power, without facing great external threats, the empire entered an erudite period. During the Middle Empire, the concept of life beyond death gained notoriety. Dying, something that was already seen as a rite of passage, became even more important in the daily life of the Egyptians. The rulers also recovered the habit of erecting pyramids as tombs. ordering the construction of ever larger monuments. The construction of the pyramids began in the ancient empire. Djoser's pyramid was the first, built around 2630 BC, located northwest of the city of Memphis. The Djoser pyramid and its tomb complex are considered the oldest monumental structures in the world, designed by architect Imhotep. During his life, Imhotep was probably one of the most important men in Egypt, with knowledge in several areas, such as medicine, architecture, religion, and carpentry. Imhotep belongs to a small group of plebs who received the status of deities in Egypt. This distinction was usually reserved for the most important members of the nobility. Imhotep's historical existence is proven through two contemporary inscriptions on the base or pedestal of one of Djoser's statues. Imhotep was such an important figure that even after his death, he continued to be revered. His grave was hidden in complete secrecy and remains unknown to this day. So far, 123 pyramids have been found and accounted for in Egypt, some of them already practically in ruins. The decision to build pyramidal tombs is justified because this is the safest way to erect a monument, because the base is wider and heavier than the top. Even so, some pyramids collapsed in antiquity, due to irregularities in their shape or the wrong choice of terrain. When this happened, the builder responsible for the work was executed. There is also the famous bent pyramid, which remains to this day. However, its shape has changed during construction. The construction of the pyramids required great physical effort and complete logistics. Each granite stone weighs approximately 2.5 tons, having been extracted from quarries, sometimes located 800 kilometers away from the construction site. They were then placed on barges and transported along the Nile River. After being unloaded, the stones were transported with ropes and sleds to the construction site. There, they were cut and sanded until they reached the necessary shape. Only then, they were dragged on ramps to the final destination. The exact number of workers participating in construction is unknown. It is believed that more than 30,000 men took part in the efforts to erect these monuments. The majority were freemen, who received a salary and tax exemption. Many slaves were also used, entrusted with the most arduous and tiring tasks. The pyramids were built by order of the pharaohs, who wanted to use them as a tomb and symbol of power and authority. The pyramids also had a symbolic character for the Egyptians, who believed that the origin of the earth came from a primordial mount in pyramidal form. The most famous pyramids are the pyramids of Giza in the necropolis of Giza, near Cairo. The necropolis has 3 pyramids. The highest is Cheops, the middle is Khafra, and the smallest is Menkaure. There are still some smaller monuments near the pyramids, known as the Pyramids of Queens. The Great Sphinx is also part of the necropolis. At their peak, the pyramids were finished with a cover of polished white limestone, which reflected the sunlight at great distances. And at the top were placed stones adorned with hieroglyphic writing. Possibly, some pyramids would have a top made of or coated in gold. It was a breathtaking vision. The Pyramid of Cheops was an impressive 146.5 meters high. Today, there are 138.8 meters left. It is the oldest of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and the only one that still exists. Almost all the pyramids were plundered, inside and out. The limestone cover and the granite stones were removed for use in other buildings over the centuries. The justification for this enormous dedication to building gigantic funerary monuments lay in the religion of the ancient Egyptians, which strongly influenced the people's view of life and death. The Egyptians left no written sources that clearly explained their beliefs. For this reason, modern historians use the paintings and scriptures left in temples, pyramids, and tombs as their source. Another source of this research are the 3 collections of hieroglyphic texts from different periods. These texts are the Book of Pyramids, the Book of Sarcophagi, and the Book of the Dead. The ancient Egyptians believed that those who had divine blood could be resurrected after a few hundred years, recovering their place as rulers. This concept of death and rebirth explains why the pharaohs created environments where they could preserve their bodies and return to life. Mummification was intended to preserve the body that would be retrieved by the sovereign. In the pharaoh's tomb were also placed precious objects, clothes, and jewelry. During the ancient empire, his personal servants, animals, and priests were also sacrificed. In many cases, his wife or wives were also buried together with the pharaoh. But this practice has lost importance in the Middle Empire. The sarcophagi were also vital importance in the incarnation of the pharaoh. The pharaoh's face was carved into the sarcophagus with the greatest possible precision. Thus, when the spirit returned to the body, he could remember what his physical appearance was like in life. Today, Islam is the official religion of Egypt. Most of the population follows Sunni precepts. Even so, there are neo-pagan groups that follow religion and the ancient gods. This practice is known as Kemetism. The last pharaoh who ruled Egypt in the Middle Empire was Amenemhat III. During his reign, he allowed for tribes of Semitic Asiatic peoples to settle in the delta of the Nile River. These tribes sought refuge from the growing threats of the Assyrian Empire. These people were known as the Hyksos, a term that can be translated to shepherd kings. In 1650 BC, uncontrolled floods in the Nile destroyed part of the Egyptian plantations, affecting the economy and weakening the empire again. The Hyksos took advantage of the instability and controlled some cities built in the Nile Delta. The Hyksos established their dynasty and elected a pharaoh, following the Egyptian model of government. The Egyptian rulers retreated to Thebes, where they were trapped between the Hyksos kingdom in the north and the Kushite kingdom in the south. This phase of Egyptian history became known as the Second Intermediate Period. Despite being invaders, the Hyksos also added their influence to the Egyptian culture, bringing good quality horses, more advanced war chariots, and new weaving techniques. For 30 years, the Egyptians fought against the Hyksos. Then, the military pharaoh Amasis won several military victories and expelled the Hyksos from Egypt. This regaining of power by the Egyptians started the new kingdom. Egypt, the land of pyramids and the pharaohs, full of lavish stories and impressive deeds, which survived in time thanks to the paintings and monuments built by the ancient Egyptians. During the New Kingdom, it became clear that the Egyptian pharaohs and their military forces were not up to foreign threats. As a solution, the Egyptians started to hire troops of mercenaries from Nubia and Libya. As a reward for their services, the mercenaries received land, where they put their families to live and work for the pharaoh. Prisoners were also used in the army, usually on the front lines. Better combat tactics were also developed. Autonomous troops of up to some 6,000 men were commanded by well-trained officers. Soldiers from humble families received a salary for their enlistment, but they practically had no chance to advance in their military career, as this right was reserved for the children of nobler families. Also, during the New Kingdom, the Egyptians began to develop their maritime fleet. The Egyptians already had well-designed and maneuverable boats. However, they were not enough to carry many soldiers and equipment. This led to the creation of beautiful war galleys with a slender and threatening design. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom created a period of unprecedented prosperity by protecting borders and strengthening diplomatic ties with their neighbors. Military campaigns, led by Pharaoh Thutmose I, led to the conquest of new lands, guaranteeing the dominance of Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon. Thutmose I ordered new constructions in several cities and elaborated new works of art, among them a stela, where his achievements as a ruler were recorded. His successors maintained territorial control, fighting rebellions in the conquered lands. His grandson Thutmose III was considered one of the most important pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Thutmose III had a great military activity, with more than 17 campaigns, and maintained his grandfather's building momentum. During the reign of Thutmose III, there was a revolt in Canaan. The Canaanites were led by the king of the city of Kadesh and assembled troops to expel the Egyptians from their territories. This dispute originated the famous Battle of Megiddo, which has enormous archaeological importance. It was the first battle to be recorded and detailed in writing in history. The Egyptians described the details of the battle on the walls of the temple of Amun-Ra, which today is in the city of Luxor, the ancient Thebes. Thutmose III gathered his army and fought against the rebels in a plain. His victory caused the Canaanites to retreat into the city of Megiddo on top of a hill. The battle ended after Megiddo was besieged for 7 months, which led to the surrender of the city. Also in the Battle of Megiddo was used for the first time the compound bow, a more effective version than the bows used previously. The victory was very profitable for the Egyptians. According to the reports, they captured 894 war chariots, 2 of them covered in gold, and 2,000 horses. After this victory and subsequent conquest of the territories, Egypt reached its peak. Its territorial domination started at the Euphrates River in Syria and went to Napata in the Kushite territory. Thutmose III still attacked the kingdom of Mitanni that belonged to the Horites. He won again and annexed new lands to Egypt and a new contingent of captured soldiers. Thutmose III is believed to have visited the Greek city of Crete, probably the first pharaoh of Upper Egypt to travel by sea and visit a foreign nation. But not everything went well for the Egyptians during the new kingdom. A turbulent period erupted when a new pharaoh took the throne. Pharaoh Akhenaten was one of the most controversial figures in Egyptian history, and his life is full of mysteries and questions. Akhenaten wanted to extinguish the cult and traditional deities of Egypt. He challenged more than 1,500 years of religious traditions when he decided to adopt only one god, decreeing that the god of Aton was the only creator of all things and living beings. The god Aton was the personification of the sun, source of light and warmth to the world. The pharaoh chose Akhenaten's name, which can be translated as "he who praises Aton." Akhenaten was a sloppy pharaoh in diplomatic and military relations. Neighboring kingdoms severed relations with Egypt, and some became threats again. The ancient Egyptians later referred to Akhenaten as the Mad Pharaoh. The monarch constantly showed his religious fervor, affirming, "Aton lives, there is no other except him." This behavior infuriated many priests and citizens, causing riots and violence in parts of the new kingdom. Akhenaten's main wife was Queen Nefertiti, who became world-renowned when her bust was found in 1912 by German archaeologists. Nefertiti is believed to have been a beautiful woman. The sculpture was never finished, with one eye missing, so that her image would not provoke the anger and jealousy of the Egyptian goddesses. After Akhenaten's death, Nefertiti disappeared from the historical records, and her fate is unknown. Akhenaten reigned for about 17 years. This time was enough for Egypt to lose much influence and dominion. Akhenaten's cause of death is unknown. There are suspicions that he was murdered by a group of priests who worshipped the ancient gods. Akhenaten had many children. One of them would have a special prominence in Egyptian history. His son was the famous Tutankhamun. After Akhenaten's death, Egypt went through a troubled period. His son was still too young to assume the throne, and his daughters could not take power because there is a living male heir. An enigmatic figure took over, Smenkhare. There are debates about whether Smenkhare was actually Nefertiti, who would have assumed the throne and changed her name. Another possibility is that Smenkhare was Akhenaten's son-in-law, taking the throne by marrying one of the daughters of the former pharaoh. Noble Ai and a general named Horemheb also appeared. Both served Akhenaten and Nefertiti. It's probably that Ai was Nefertiti's father. Ai aspired to reach the throne and had members of the royal family murdered. The young Tutankhamun and his half-sister Ankhesenamun were rescued and taken to Thebes. Tutankhamun was crowned pharaoh at only 9 years of age. To strengthen the lineage, he married his half-sister, who was only 11 years old. Due to Tutankhamun's age, Ai ruled Egypt with the position of vizier, a kind of regent. His government was supported by General Horemheb. As the years progressed, Tutankhamun had a more active and authoritarian voice, ordering the construction of temples for the ancient gods of Egypt. This allowed to restore the cult of different deities. In 1324 BC, Tutankhamun died at the age of 14. The reason for his death has given rise to various speculations: disease, poisoning, or murder. The last option was not unlikely, because Tutankhamun was a threat to Ai's plans. Another event that reinforces the hypothesis of murder is that right after Tutankhamun's death, his wife, Ankhesenamun, sent letters to the king of the Hittites, asking him to send one of his children to marry her and be crowned pharaoh of Egypt. The Hittites and Egyptians were always enemies. This shows that Ankhesenamun's request was motivated by fear and urgency. With reluctance, the king of the Hittites sent one of his sons to meet Ankhesenamun, but mysteriously, this prince never entered Egypt. It is likely that he was murdered by spies, following Ai's orders. Ankhesenamun ended up marrying Ai, most probably against her will. A few months later, after her marriage to Ai, poor Ankhesenamun died abruptly. It is not difficult to deduce that this too was the order of the cruel Ai. Tutankhamun has a great importance for the history of ancient Egypt. His tomb, although small in comparison with other pharaohs, was almost intact when it was discovered. Tutankhamun's tomb was found in the Valley of the Kings in 1922 by Howard Carter. The tomb was not desecrated by thieves, and this originated the famous legend of the Tutankhamun curse, in which if someone violated the pharaoh's tomb, he would suffer a terrible death. In the tomb were found 3 amphorae of wine, one of them with white wine, and a dagger whose blade was created with the iron of a meteorite. The tomb also had baskets with cereals, jewels, clothes, statues of the god Anubis, and 2 small mummies of female fetuses, probably daughters of Tutankhamun, born prematurely. The mummy of Tutankhamun was kept in 3 sarcophagi. The smaller one, which kept the young pharaoh's body, was made of gold. Although short, Tutankhamun's story is full of murder, betrayal, and intrigue. It deserves to be known and remembered to this day. As for Regent Ai, he seems to have died of old age. As he had no heirs, he was succeeded by General Horemheb. Horemheb, although he was a military general, was accepted by the people as a pharaoh because he successfully served Egypt in the wars. Egyptian history would still have many twists and turns in the future, and the arrival of famous pharaoh Ramses II would cause fear in the hearts of Egypt's enemies. The great Egyptian pyramids have remained firm over the centuries. Their monumental splendor showed the effort of the Egyptian people to maintain the glory of their empire. After the tragic reign of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, Egypt was ruled by a former general named Horemheb. Horemheb established order in Egypt, creating stricter laws, which included, as punishment for crimes, cutting off the nose of the evildoer and exiling him into the desert. Horemheb continued the struggle to re-establish the cult of the ancient gods. He even tried to erase the records of Akhenaten's reign, referring to the ancient pharaoh as a demon who wanted to destroy the beliefs in the true gods. Horemheb had no heirs, so he was named as his successor Ramses I, his closest friend and a general of the Egyptian army. Ramses I assumed the throne at about 50 years of age and reigned for only 2 years. He was replaced by his son Seti I. Seti I fought against the Hittites and conquered the city of Kadesh. The Hittites established a peace agreement with the Egyptians that lasted 15 years. Seti I recovered other territories that had belonged to Egypt before the reign of Akhenaten, but Seti I also stayed a short time on the throne, as he died at only 40 years of age. The mummy of Seti I is considered one of the most beautiful and most preserved until today. It is currently in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Seti I's successor was his son, the famous Ramses II. There were 11 sovereigns named Ramses in the history of Egypt, but only Ramses II is known as Ramses the Great. He is considered the greatest pharaoh in Egypt, and his reign was the most prosperous and extensive in Egyptian history. When Ramses II was about 10 years old, his father took him with him in the military campaigns. Ramses was present in battles in Libya, Canaan, and Sinai. Ramses grew up as a young warrior prince and was considered impetuous and arrogant. At the beginning of his reign, he traveled to Phoenicia to define new boundaries for the Egyptian territories. However, he entered the territory of the Hittites and claimed the lands conquered at the time of Thutmose III. The proud Hittites considered it an offense, and the war between 2 empires started again. The king of the Hittites summoned many soldiers and asked for reinforcements of cities and towns allied to the Hittites. Ramses II also had a large army, composed of Egyptian soldiers, African and Lebanese mercenaries. Ramses had a strong and impatient personality. This made him take the initiative and march towards Kadesh, which had been reconquered by the Hittites. The Egyptian army was organized in 4 divisions. Although they were numerically inferior to the Hittites, they were better trained and disciplined. Suddenly, 2 Hittite soldiers gave themselves to the Egyptians. They claimed to be deserters, but in fact they were spies. After gaining the trust of the Egyptians, the spies passed the false information that the Hittite army was still far from Kadesh. Ramses wanted to take the opportunity to quickly reconquer the city and advance with his personal guard and a division of his army, while the other Egyptian forces advanced in slower pace. Already near the city of Kadesh, Ramses realized that he had fallen into a trap. The Hittites emerged from different directions and surrounded the Egyptian troops. It was such an unexpected event that it was recorded as the first military ambush in history. Even surrounded, Ramses and his personal guard used their war chariots and managed to make way against the enemy troops, breaking the siege. Meanwhile, the Egyptian infantry contained the advance of the enemies. Ramses managed to regroup with the other divisions of his army that came to his aid. Then he launched a counterattack that quickly dispersed the Hittites. That day, the king of the Hittites lost his brother, who was killed during the battle. Finally, the 2 forces retreated, both with many casualties and exhausted soldiers. Ramses retreated to Egypt, and King Hittite to the north of his territory. Technically, the fight had ended in a tie, but both leaders declared to have come out as winners of the battle. After a few more years of conflict and hostilities, Egypt finally signed a peace treaty with the Hittite Empire. It was a remarkable event, as it was the first peace treaty in history. The peace treaty was also motivated by the growing threat of the Assyrian Empire. They were increasingly strong and were a danger to Egyptians and Hittites. In the peace treaty, the Egyptian Empire and the Hittite Empire promised to support each other against external threats, something that delayed the advance of the Assyrians for some time. For almost being defeated, Ramses II became wiser and more cautious. During his reign, he maintained the alliance with the Hittites. Strange as it may seem, Ramses II married 3 or 4 daughters, but there are discussions about whether this really happened. Also, during the reign of Ramses II, the cities grew in size and population. Many temples and other works were built, bringing more prosperity to Egypt. Today, the name Ramses II became famous for being used in Hollywood movies, where he is pointed out as the pharaoh of the biblical Exodus, responsible for imprisoning and enslaving the Hebrews in Egypt. However, more complete studies point out that Thutmose III as the pharaoh of the Exodus. Ramses II will have died at over 90 years of age, something quite unusual at that time. After the death of Ramses, Egypt entered again an unstable period. His children died abruptly, and the Egyptian throne became empty several times, something very dangerous for a powerful nation. The responsibility was assumed by Merneptah, the 13th son of Ramses II. Merneptah was already over 60 years old when he assumed the throne. He did not have the strength to govern the great number of cities and provinces. With the government weakened, the priests of the Temple of Amun came to have even more political power, since they claimed to be the link between the gods and the people. To further complicate matters, Egypt's wealth attracted other greedy kingdoms. Egypt was attacked by pirates from the coast of the Greek islands of western Anatolia. These pirates became known as Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples were no ordinary pirates. The brutality and frequency of their attacks destabilized the economy and the government of the Great Bronze Age empires. They destroyed almost the entire Minoan and Mycenaean kingdom. They also devastated the Hittite Empire, which was already weakened after several civil wars. We don't know if the Sea Peoples were a single tribe or a confederation of tribes that joined together to loot and invade the Near East, but they were numerous, skilled sailors, and combatants on land. The invasions of the Sea Peoples are probably motivated by natural disasters, earthquakes, and tsunamis that devastated the Aegean islands and the coastal regions of Greece and Turkey. These natural disasters destabilized much of the dominant kingdoms and were responsible for the decline of the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete. Pharaoh Meneptah managed to stop the invasion of the Sea Peoples in the Battle of the Delta. But some years later, Pharaoh Ramses III managed to expel the Sea Peoples from Egypt. The Sea Peoples continued to devastate and dominate territories in Palestine. The impact of these invasions was so great that the Sea Peoples are held responsible for the collapse of the Bronze Age. Finally, Ramses III followed the Egyptian tradition of turning enemies into allies. He established agreements with the Nubians and the Libyans. Egypt started to hire mercenaries from the Sea Peoples. Ramses III was a strong pharaoh, but his reign was turbulent. He was murdered at the age of 65 in a coup organized by one of his wives, who wanted his son as the next heir to the throne. Egypt was financially exhausted. Its coffers were emptied by the war against the pirate invaders. The situation was so bad that the population's food was rationed. During this period, the first labor strike in history occurred. When workers from various areas did not receive their grain, they refused to work for the pharaoh. Egypt has entered a vertiginous decline marked by hunger, violence, and corruption. The empire was devastated for about 2 decades. Egypt was again divided into different dynasties. Ambitious leaders confronted each other in small battles to dominate territories. Egypt entered a phase known as the Third Intermediate Period. During this period, chaos reigned. Part of Egypt was commanded by pharaohs of Lebanese origin, while another part was ruled by pharaohs of Nubian origin. The cunning priests of the Temple of Amun took advantage of the situation and controlled Thebes and other nearby territories. The Assyrians also took advantage of the fall of the Hittite Empire and the weakening of the Egyptians. They invaded Egypt, and in the conquered cities, they placed Assyrian rulers to control the population. Under the rule of the foreign forces, the once proud Egyptian empire was subjugated and impotent, but it would not be the end of its history. There were still many unexpected events. Throughout its history, Egypt went through periods of glory and power, but it also faced difficulties during the terrible droughts that brought hunger and suffering. The wealthiness of Egypt also attracted the attention of many powerful realms. Many enemies wanted to invade the Egyptian territories. In 525 BC, the Persians invaded Egypt, commanded by King Cambyses II. The Persians had already defeated the Babylonian Empire, and nothing seemed to satisfy their ambitions for new territories. The Persian domination of Egypt lasted until 332 BC and was overthrown by a young and ambitious conqueror, Alexander the Great. Alexander seemed unstoppable. He conquered city after city, winning battles even under unfavorable conditions for his army. He dominated many Persian territories, and, after defeating King Darius III in a great battle, besieged the city of Tyre in Phoenicia. After a great siege, the city was conquered. Alexander destroyed it as a punishment for non-surrender. Alexander and his army headed for Egypt. The Persian ruler who commanded Egypt had the good sense to surrender without offering much resistance. Alexander was received by the Egyptian people as a liberator. He was proclaimed as the son of the god Amun, receiving many treasures. Alexander spent a short time in Egypt, but during his stay, he founded the city of Alexandria, one of the most important cities of the ancient world. It would become the capital of Egypt in the following 1,000 years. With Egypt's dominion secured, Alexander set out for Mesopotamia to attack the heart of the Persian Empire. After the death of Alexander the Great, the Egyptian government was controlled by the Macedonian general Ptolemy I. He declared himself pharaoh of Egypt and began the Ptolemaic dynasty. The influence of Greek culture brought by Macedonians influenced much of Egyptian life, but this happened in a natural way. The Macedonian rulers respected and encouraged the traditional customs of Egypt. Over the years, pharaohs of Macedonian origin were represented as Egyptians. Marriages between Greeks and Egyptians became common, and gods of both cultures were merged. One example is the deity that received the name of Ammon Zeus. The military equipment of the Egyptians almost completely assumed the Greek style. Even commercial boats and war galleys began to be built in the Greek style, which was more advanced and robust. All the male pharaohs of this period of Egyptian history used the name Ptolemy to honor the founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemaic established a great trade route, mainly by sea, and this made Egypt prosper again. During the Ptolemaic dynasty, the famous Alexandria Library was also built, which had thousands of papyruses and clay tablets with the most diverse registers and studies in areas of mathematics, philosophy, and architecture. The Ptolemaic kingdom went into decline with Ptolemy. He was a detestable king, lazy in political affairs, easily corruptible, and cruel. He had relatives killed, including his brother, father, and mother. At the end of the Ptolemaic kingdom, Egypt was plunged into political chaos. Many Ptolemaic pharaohs were cruel tyrants. Murders within the family were common. While Egypt was going through another turbulent period, a new threat from the Mediterranean Sea was aimed at reaching the land of the pharaohs. Rome had already conquered vast territories in much of the European continent and wanted to further expand its domains. The Roman Senate decided to intervene in the political situation of the Egyptians because Rome depended a lot on grains exported from Egypt. If another civil war occurred, Rome would run out of food for its legions. The famous Cleopatra was not the first with this name. She was part of the Ptolemaic dynasty, direct descendant of Ptolemy I. In her childhood, she studied with Greek teachers and was educated in religious cults of different cultures. It was said that Cleopatra could speak 8 languages. Cleopatra became queen at 18. Despite sharing power with Ptolemy XIII, her younger brother, she seems to have dealt with the kingdom's problems alone. At the beginning of her reign, she had serious problems. Egypt was facing another drought and period of hunger. As time went by, Cleopatra's younger brother began to confront his sister. He had the support of his childhood tutors and other nobles who preferred a male ruler. Cleopatra married Ptolemy XIII, but it was a merely symbolic marriage, for they never had a good relationship, nor did they consummate the union. Ptolemy XIII eventually removed Cleopatra from her position and began to reign alone. The Egyptian population revolted, and of course, Rome was watching everything, fearing another civil war in Egypt. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt with his troops, staying in the palace of Alexandria. Cleopatra, knowing the fame of the Roman general, did not waste time and sought to establish an alliance with him. Cleopatra was successful in her negotiations with Julius Caesar. The two became allies and lovers. Now they needed to overthrow the usurper brother and recover the Egyptian lathe. Caesar called troops to besiege Alexandria. This was followed by a series of clashes between the Romans and Ptolemy XIII's troops. Finally, a great battle took place on the west bank of the Nile River. Ptolemy XIII had about 20,000 men, and Julius Caesar had a smaller number of troops. But Caesar advanced with his army, which received Greek reinforcements. Both military forces advanced by land, while the boats traveled along the Nile River. It was a battle that took place on land and water. Caesar and Ptolemy followed the movements of the troops as they sailed on their boats. The battle on land was brutal. Ptolemy's troops were on higher ground and forced the Romans to retreat. Many Roman soldiers fled and swam towards the boat. During the confusion, Caesar's galley capsized with the weight of the men who climbed aboard. Julius Caesar had to swim to the riverbank to survive. At the height of this confusion, the Greeks arrived to support Caesar. The Romans managed to regroup their troops and counterattack with the help of the Greek allies. They conquered the Egyptian camp where Ptolemy's troops were. With this turnaround, Ptolemy's troops fled to the Egyptian boats. Ptolemy's boat also capsized. Ptolemy was not as lucky as Caesar. He drowned because of his heavy armor, which dragged him to the bottom of the Nile. After the battle, Cleopatra returned to the throne. Most of the conspirators were arrested or executed. In 44 BC, Julius Caesar was murdered in the Senate of Rome. Cleopatra sought a new alliance with General Mark Antony. Mark Antony and Cleopatra were married in Egypt, but Rome never considered this marriage official, since Mark Antony was already married to a Roman. Mark Antony offered Cleopatra vast territories that belonged to Rome. In his will, he affirmed his desire to be buried in Alexandria. The Roman Senate rebelled and gave General Octavian permission to go to war against Mark Antony and Cleopatra. To face the situation, Cleopatra joined her army to that of Mark Antony. It was the largest maritime fleet ever seen in history. They left for Greece, where they were intercepted by the fleet of Roman ships. The maritime battle was disastrous for Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Their naval fleet was destroyed by the Romans. Luckily, both managed to escape alive. A year later, Octavian besieged Alexandria and defeated the city's defenses without much difficulty, destroying the plans and ambitions of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Cleopatra was an enormously powerful woman. She managed to keep Egypt united and, throughout her life, protected the territory from being swallowed by Rome. Cleopatra's life and personality were so remarkable that they continue to be an inspiration to this day. In our channel, we have a mini-series that tells in detail the incredible story of this great woman. Take a look at the videos. After millennia of existence, memorable battles, and political intrigues, Pharaonic Egypt lost its independence and became a province under Roman rule. The legacy of the ancient Egyptians is extremely valuable to human history. And of course, Egypt will continue to be remembered as the cradle of one of the greatest civilizations ever. The Akkadians are part of the lineage of the Semitic, who inhabited the region of northern Syria. The Akkadians arrived in Mesopotamia around 2550 BC. They were probably looking for fertile land to settle. Right at the beginning of their expansion, the Akkadians and Sumerians had some quarrels, followed by a period of peace, which was very fruitful for the Akkadians. They kept their trade alive and an exchange of cultural linguistic relations with the Sumerians, adopting and adapting the style of cuneiform writing. But, unlike the Sumerians, who valued the development of the arts and sciences, the Akkadians were bellicose people and held war in great esteem. The Akkadians were also polytheistic. As time passed, their gods mixed with the Sumerian deities. A good example is the goddess of fertilization Ishtar, who for the Akkadians originated from the goddess Namu, who was the goddess of the seas for the Sumerians. The Akkadians then regarded their kings as deities, or referred to them as envoys of the gods to command their subjects on earth. The Akkadian kings also held the title of supreme priests. The coexistence between Akkadians and Sumerians had reached a point of harmony. Nevertheless, the Sumerians controlled much of the region's trade, which prevented the development of the Akkadian cities. The Sumerians were always surrounded by enemies. There were the enemy kingdoms of the Elamites and the Hurrian, and many other nomadic tribes that kept invading Sumerian lands. Also, the Sumerians had internal wars, with one city-state trying to defeat the other. Then, around 2375 BC, the Sumerian king Lugal-Zaggisi unified all Sumerian cities after several battles. Lugal-Zaggisi ruled the Sumerians for about 30 years. During this period, the Sumerians and Akkadians already lived almost as one people, having several members of the nobility of both peoples sharing positions in society. Suddenly, in the Sumerian city of Kish, Sargon emerged, who later became known as Sargon the Great. The origin of Sargon is not clear. The text written in clay at the time is incomplete, and it's also not clear how he managed to ascend to the throne. On the clay plate, the following was written: In Akkadian, Sargon, whose father was a gardener, the cupbearer of Ur-Zababa, became king, the king of Akkadian, who built Akkad. He ruled for 56 years. After taking power over the city of Kish, Sargon declared war against the Sumerian king Lugal-Zaggisi and attacked the city of Uruk, which was conquered after a fierce battle. Lugal-Zaggisi was captured during the battle, and Sargon, as a sign of his superiority and disdain for the enemies, he put a collar around the neck of the defeated king and dragged him to the gates of his city. After that major victory, Sargon and his army kept conquering the other Sumerian cities and territories of the Elamites and Hurrians, creating the first empire in history, the first Mesopotamian empire. Sargon's fame was so vast that he started to be called sovereign of the four corners of the earth, and his empire spread from Syria to the Persian Gulf and even reached the Mediterranean Sea. Sargon was so powerful and influential that he's even mentioned in Babylonian texts. Exalting his deeds, the Babylonians wrote, "Sargon had no rival, no equal. His splendor spread upon the lands." At the same time of Sargon's grandiose achievements, war was a frequent reality for the peoples of Mesopotamia, which generated efforts to improve the military equipment used by the Akkadian soldiers. The Akkadians worshipped lions, had sculptures and paintings of these animals in their temples and palaces, and some records refer that these animals were captured to be used in battles. Sargon died around 2215 BC at about 85 years of age, a very impressive age for the time. Soon after his death, many uprisings took place throughout the empire, and Sargon's offspring failed to maintain power for long. Little by little, the Akkadians were subjugated by the Goths, a tribe of nomads from the Zagros Mountains at the top of the Tigris River. After 2 centuries of existence, the first great empire in history collapsed. Sargon the Great was a powerful figure and inspired the kings of the Middle East for many generations to come. The history of the human race is filled with civilizations and empires, but that wasn't always the case. At the end of the Neolithic period, a great share of people still had a semi-nomadic lifestyle, wandering from one region to another in search of hunting and other food sources. With the dominance of agriculture and the domestication of animals, human beings began to create ever larger settlements, which allowed a considerable spike in population numbers. Around the year 4000 BC, some tribes started to settle in the south of ancient Mesopotamia, a region between Iraq, Iran, and Syria, bathed by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These tribes gave birth to what is probably the most important civilization in history, the Sumerians. The Sumerian civilization was fascinating, responsible for most of the breakthroughs during the Bronze Age. The Sumerians were pioneers in the drainage of swamps and irrigation system for crops. They possessed an intricate and properly developed language, which facilitated trade and the exchange of knowledge with other peoples. The Sumerians also stood out for their artistic ability, developing fine crafts and having great skill as artisans, marble and wood sculpting, and creating beautiful bronze sculptures. And perhaps most importantly, they came up with the idea of writing. The Sumerians developed the cuneiform writing, with small, wedge-shaped objects and clay tablets to engrave the symbols. Cuneiform writing was sophisticated for that time. Using it, the Sumerians recorded the important events, even crafting poems and law codes. The texts written by the Sumerians ranged from mathematical calculations to the study of astronomy and medicine. Later, the cuneiform writing was adopted by other peoples such as the Babylonians, Hittites, and Assyrians. The Sumerians are also known for the improvement of tools such as hammers, mattocks, and picks, in addition to bronze weapons with an impressive quality for that period. The Sumerians worshipped many different gods who were called Anunnaki, a group of deities responsible for the creation of humanity. These were associated with natural disasters, such as floods and earthquakes, as a form of punishment to humans for their sins. To the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were heavenly beings who came to Earth in search of gold, and to facilitate the mining of the precious metal, they gave birth to the human race. The fact that the Sumerians were considered the inventors of astronomy and studied the movement of the planets in the solar system fueled the belief in modern times that the gods Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings who visited our world long ago and taught the early peoples how to grow food and build larger cities. The Sumerians founded the cities of Kish, Nippur, Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, and Ur, which became important cultural and commercial hubs in the region. But these cities did not belong to a single kingdom. Each had its autonomy as city-states, being ruled by its kings and maintaining its cultural traits. The city of Ur was particularly important among the Sumerian cities as an important center of trade in the region, with several religious temples, such as the famous Great Ziggurat of Ur. The Sumerian kings often maintained peace, but sometimes they fought wars for the domination of new territories. The wealth of the Sumerians began to incite the ambition of other neighboring peoples, such as the Elamites and Amorites, who constantly attacked to plunder the Sumerian cities. These conflicts gave rise to the first written war in history. The war took place in 2700 BC between the Sumerians and the kingdom of the Elamites. The Sumerian king of the city of Kish was called Enme-Baragesi. He led a Sumerian contingent against the kingdom of the Elamites. Back then, combat tactics could already make all the difference between victory or defeat. The Sumerians had trained and relatively disciplined soldiers who fought in shield wall formations when needed, Probably the most fearsome weapon of the time was the war chariots, with 2 axles and pulled by 4 animals, horses, or donkeys. It is easy to imagine that the number of casualties was high during these battles. There was little protection, and the combat was fought in close proximity. Also, there were carriages with units shooting darts, spears, and trying to run over the less fortunate soldiers. The Sumerians won the battle and recorded on a clay tablet, "We continue to plunder the weapons of the Elamites." Over time, other peoples of Mesopotamia developed large cities and increasingly bigger and well-trained armies. The Sumerian civilization did not resist the military advance of several kingdoms and ended up succumbing. It is believed that climate change also caused a major drought in the region, which contributed to the decline and disappearance of the Sumerian culture. Albeit their tragic end, the Sumerians played a key role in the cultural and social development of the peoples of Mesopotamia. These new kingdoms made good use of the Sumerian legacy, and thanks to their heritage, their names will be forever in history. On the edge of the Aegean Sea, there is a large island. It was named Crete and was home to one of the most incredible and developed civilizations of the Bronze Age. This civilization almost remained forgotten in history, and its discovery was the consequence of major efforts of Arthur Evans. Arthur John Evans was an English archaeologist. He inherited his father's fortune, who was also an archaeologist. He traveled to Greece to study the rubble of the city of Mycenae. In his studies, he found evidence of an unknown civilization at the time, which led him to different places in Greece in search of answers. Finally, Arthur reached the island of Crete, where, guided by stories of the population, found the site of the legendary palace of Knossos, which belonged to King Minos of the legend of the Minotaur. The excavations of the site yielded discoveries that would make Arthur dedicate his entire life to his research. Arthur Evans called the people he discovered Minoans. It was named after King Minos, who, according to Greek myth, was the son of Zeus. The Minoans likely arrived in Crete from Anatolia, where Turkey is today. That migration also occurred in the Middle Paleolithic period, in 128,000 BC. However, the Minoan culture only started to develop after having mastered agriculture, which occurred around 5000 BC. As the Bronze Age advanced, the Minoans began to develop a culture based on sea trading, using their incredibly advanced ships for the first time. The Minoan vessels were elegant and robust. They could carry food and goods. Thanks to their ability to sail for days at sea, the Minoans began to trade with people from Anatolia, Phoenicia, Greece, Egypt, and Africa. Its culture soon began to flourish in many ways. Since the island of Crete offered natural protection, it did not endure invasions from other peoples for centuries. Around 2000 BC, the biggest source of income for the Minoans was agriculture. They produced olive oil, wines, and ceramic items with beautiful paintings. Minoan art highlighted all the sophistication of those people. Their paintings had a unique style and exhibited a deeply advanced artistic level. The beauty of women was exalted in several depictions, with large, dark, and wavy hair, colorful dresses, and lip and eye makeup. Men were usually depicted with dark skin, athletic bodies, and defiant posture. The Minoans also produced gold and silver jewelry, even pieces made of crystal. Although they did not have a war-oriented society, the Minoans used warriors to protect palaces and ships, to fight pirates and possible invaders. The Minoans were deeply attached to physical and athletic development. They had sports competitions like swimming, boxing, and racing. The most impressive sport was perhaps dancing around and jumping over an angry bull. This practice is called taurokathapsia and consisted of grabbing the horns of the bull during its attack. When the bull shook its head up in an attempt to free himself, the athlete took advantage of the impulse to make acrobatic jumps over the animal. To the Minoans, the bulls were sacred creatures, constantly exalted in sculptures and paintings. The religion of the Minoans appeared to be matriarchal. with the figure of a goddess holding two serpents as the supreme divinity. During the excavations of Arthur Evans, clay slabs were discovered with unknown writing, a large part of which cannot be translated to this day. To Arthur's surprise, and all those involved in the excavations, the Palace of Knossos was much bigger than expected. Knossos Palace has over 700,000 square meters, 3 times larger than Buckingham Palace in England. The excavations discovered the possible throne of King Minos, the oldest in all of Europe. The oldest paved road in Europe was also discovered. It was located at the entrance of the city, divided into streets surrounding the houses and temples. Some parts of the city had a water drainage system, which worked as a sewer. And something surprising was found below the palace, a labyrinth. This labyrinth contained several massive jars, used to store grain and wine. Some parts seem to have been used as a dungeon for prisoners. Designs of mazes and the Minotaur were also engraved on their coins, emphasizing the odd legend about this monstrous creature. The island of Crete is in a seismic region. To this day, there are earthquakes and strong sea waves. Around 1750 BC, there was an earthquake in Crete that destroyed much of the Minoan buildings. The Minoans remained on the island and rebuilt their palaces and houses. Historians Herodotus and Thucydides claim that the Minoans became lords of the Aegean Sea, ending piracy in the region. They colonized other islands near Crete. Thucydides tells that King Minos sent his sons to rule these islands. By the middle of 1700 BC, the Minoans were already a famous and respected people. Even the kingdoms that arose in Greece, such as Mycenae and Athens, recognized the independence of the Minoans. Crete had become a must-see stop for countless boats coming from many regions. Merchant boats from Egypt were selling their products in Crete. From there, these products were taken to Greece and Anatolia. The same happened with products from other regions. In Minoan society, the imbalance between rich and poor was not clear. The people were always depicted working together. Women were also portrayed as an important part of the kingdom, and not just wives or daughters, as in other cultures of the same period. But what does the history of the Minoan civilization have to do with the legendary Atlantis? Atlantis appeared in a story written by Plato between 428 to 347 BC. Plato found inspiration in something that happened 1,000 years before his time. During Plato's period, the Minoans were already part of ancient stories. Due to this, and because it was based on exaggerated tales, Plato imagined and described an ancient kingdom more advanced and powerful than the kingdoms of his own time. But not everything was a product of Plato's imagination. The Minoans were indeed advanced and ingenious people. There were many theories of where Atlantis would be. Most likely, it was the Minoan city on the island of Santorini. The island of Santorini was one of the most important for Minoan trade. There was a huge volcano on it. When the volcano erupted, it almost completely destroyed the island and its buildings. A large part of the island sank into the sea, dragging everything with it, which greatly affected the Minoan trade with northern kingdoms. As if that were not enough, a huge cataclysm occurred shortly after. A strong earthquake, followed by a tsunami with waves of up to 20 meters, affected all of Greece, and especially the island of Crete. The devastation was much greater than that caused by an atomic bomb. The houses and palaces were yet again destroyed. With such seismic activity, the volcano of the island of Santorini erupted again. Despite the distance, its ashes invaded the island of Crete, blocking the sunlight and generating a toxic mist that killed crops and animals, and famine brought revolts and violence throughout Crete. It reached a point of despair, and there were reports that the Minoans resorted to cannibalism. Unfortunately for the Minoans, not even they could fight against the forces of nature. one of the most advanced societies of their time fell into savagery. A disaster of such proportions served as inspiration for Plato to create his story about Atlantis. There probably never was the city of Atlantis, which is a myth. The Minoan people were brave and still attempted to rebuild their cities, but the economy was already feeble and the Minoan kingdom was losing its wealth while other kingdoms were growing. The Greek kingdom of Mycenae kept conquering almost all of Greece, already moving towards the Aegean islands. It is unclear whether Mycenae took Crete by force or offered help in exchange for giving up the territory. The fact is that Minoans and Mycenaean merged their cultures. 2 centuries later, started to recover the island of Crete. According to Homer, in his epic poem about the Trojan War, the Mycenaean ships commanded by King Agamemnon set sail for Troy from the island of Crete. In 1200 BC, the Mycenaean Empire went into decline, largely due to pirate attacks that destroyed everything in their path. Even the mighty Egypt suffered great losses against the Aegean Sea pirates. The last inhabitants of Crete abandoned their cities and took refuge for over a century in the mountains of the island. This allowed other peoples from Greece to occupy the ancient Minoan cities, no longer able to withstand invaders. One of the most splendid cultures of the ancient world came to an end. The Minoans are considered to be the first European civilization. Their influence was enormous for the Greek people who appeared afterward. Due to them as well, the trading and relationships of many civilizations became possible in the Bronze Age. Great civilizations do not disappear overnight, as in the legend of Atlantis, but their stories can be as incredible and rich as those imagined by the best writers. The Age of Bronze was marked by the rise of great civilizations responsible for the development of new technologies and breakthroughs for humanity. Some ancient peoples, like the Sumerians, Babylonians, and Egyptians, stood out for their contribution to the improvement of agriculture and architecture. Other peoples, like the Phoenicians and Minoans, developed new forms of art, commerce, and writing. But there were also warlike civilizations which became prominent in the art of war, like the Mycenaean civilization. The Mycenaeans formed the first advanced civilization in continental Greece, with a well-organized system of city-states, urban organization, works of art, and writing system. According to DNA analyses, the Mycenaeans were part of the same group of tribes that migrated to Greece in the Middle Paleolithic period. These tribes spread to the islands and the region of the Peloponnese, originating the first Greek settlements. On the island of Crete, for example, one of these tribes founded the kingdom of the Minoans, which was Plato's inspiration for creating the legend of Atlantis. The famous Greek poet Homer used different names to refer to these tribes in his famous epic poem entitled Iliad. According to Homer, the tribes that stood out the most in that period of Greek history were the Achaeans, the Danaans, and the Argives. Over time, with the dominance of agriculture, commerce, and bronze metallurgy, these tribes founded the first city-states of Greece. The largest and richest of those Greek cities was Mycenae, whose name was the basis for naming an entire civilization. The city of Mycenae was found in 1876 by the German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann. Heinrich used Homer's accounts as the basis for his investigations. To the surprise of many scholars of the time, the accounts were right. In his poems Iliad and Odyssey, Homer described the land where Mycenae and other cities were built and the surrounding landscape. With these descriptions, Heinrich and his team discovered the sites where the ruins of the cities of Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Troy were located. Around 1750 BC, the Mycenaeans and Minoans of the island of Crete created a busy line of trade between their main cities. Trade between the two kingdoms added new influences to the Mycenaeans, who began to copy the Minoan style of art and writing. For this reason, the historical period is known as the Creto-Mycenaean period. However, unlike the Minoans, who had a culture focused on commerce and navigation, the Mycenaeans were openly a warlike society. Little is known about the beginning of the Mycenaean civilization, but legend has it that the founder of Mycenae was the hero Perseus, half-brother of Hercules, famous for killing the Gorgon Medusa. There are indications that in 1500 BC, Mycenae was already a well-structured city, with strong walls in all of its extension. The excavations in Mycenae revealed much important evidence for the understanding of Mycenaean society. The Mycenaeans buried their kings in secret tombs known as tholos, which were excavated inside natural hills. In all, 9 tombs were found. A large part of them was intact, and many objects could be rescued for study and taken to museums. A curious and unusual fact is that the Brazilian Emperor Pedro II traveled to Greece to visit the excavations. He was invited by Heinrich Schliemann for a lunch organized inside one of these tombs. In 1350 BC, the walls of Mycenae and some nearby cities were rebuilt to house the rapid growth of the population. The stones used to build the new walls were so big and heavy that the walls became famous for being built by a giant cyclops. Many myths and fantastic stories of ancient Greece happened during the Mycenaean period. Heroes and demigods such as Perseus, Hercules, Theseus, Odysseus, Achilles, and many others were part of the Mycenaean world. Many Greeks of the classical period looked to their Mycenaean ancestors as a people closer to the divine lineage and capable of great deeds and achievements. Although they lived in Greece, the Mycenaeans were vastly different from the traditional image we have of the ancient Greeks. Their clothes, architecture, weapons, and armor were more rustic and robust. Many times they valued a more aggressive appearance. The Mycenaeans used many weapons made of bronze, including spears and axes with threatening shapes. Their swords were incredibly well made, and the most beautiful had engravings and handles made of gold. The shields used by Mycenaeans were large and heavy. Some were fully coated in bronze. The warriors' armors were the main highlight, with a great variety of shapes, sizes, and colors. Their helmets were meant to express the courage and strength of the warriors. They were adorned with horsehair and horns. They also used animal skins, such as bovine leather, for their shields, and feline skins, such as lions and leopards, to complement their armor. The Mycenaeans had the best armors of their time. Some covered almost the entire body, being made with large bronze plates that made them quite heavy. To fight while wearing these armors, the warriors had to truly be strong. The Mycenaeans also made recurrent use of war chariots, spreading terror on the battlefields when they tried to run over their enemies. In Mycenaean society, the king was the military and political commander. The people were divided between free workers and slaves. The Mycenaeans produced and exported wheat, oil, wine, ceramics, and bronze, using gold to create jewelry and decorative pieces. Among the pieces produced in gold are the famous funeral masks, made to cover the faces of the deceased and preserve their image. The variety of products produced by Mycenaeans allowed them to develop a great sea trade route. Mycenaean objects were discovered in Syria, Egypt, Cyprus, Italy, and the Iberian Peninsula. As time went by, the Mycenaeans replaced the elegant style of the boats used by the Minoans and began to create stronger ships focused on combat. Little is known about the original religion of the Mycenaeans, but they created the basis of Greek mythology as we know it. The main deity of the Mycenaeans was Poseidon. At the time, he was considered the god of the seas, land, and earthquakes. Around the year 1370 BC, several earthquakes occurred in Greece and nearby regions. The earthquakes caused so much destruction that the island of Crete was devastated. The Mycenaeans took the opportunity to claim the right to rule the island, considering that it was an important commercial port in the Aegean Sea. In the following 2 centuries, the Mycenaeans incorporated the Minoans into their culture, further expanding the influence of the Greek kingdoms. The most famous of the Mycenaean kings was Agamemnon, who reigned in Mycenae. His brother Menelaus reigned in the young city of Sparta. Both kings married Spartan princesses. Agamemnon married Clytemnestra, and Menelaus married a woman who would leave her name in history, Helen. Agamemnon spared no effort to expand the maritime trade routes with other kingdoms and empires. This caused Mycenaean ships to travel to ports in increasingly distant and exotic cities. One of these cities was in a privileged geographic location. Troy was to the west of Anatolia, where today is Turkey, more precisely in a region called Hisarlik. As there are strong winds in the region that constantly change the tides, many boats needed to slow down their pace or even find refuge in some pier for several days, waiting for the calm of the sea. Taking advantage of this situation, Troy collected taxes from the boats and goods that passed through its territory. Many of these goods were sold in the city itself. If the merchant refused to pay, his goods, boats, and all his money were confiscated by the Trojans. But who were the Trojans? We know little about Troy and its inhabitants. It is believed that they were a part of people known as Dardani, or at least they built their culture together with them. We know that the city of Troy welcomed travelers from different regions. For this reason, Trojans had various styles of clothing, jewelry, and military equipment. One of the few documents of antiquity that quotes the Trojans was written by the Hittites, who referred to them as Wilusa. Troy remained an unknown entity for a long time. It was first found by Frank Calvert in 1863. In 1870, Heinrich Schliemann led the excavations of the city. To his surprise, there was not only one Troy, but 9 cities, one built above the other. Heinrich's excavations revealed that Troy had been invaded, plundered, and destroyed countless times over the centuries. The city was rebuilt several times over the rubble of the previous incarnation. At the time of the Trojan War, the city was already in its 6th phase. According to Homer, it had strong walls and divided into 2 or 3 sections, which made the city an exceedingly difficult fortress to be torn down. The taxes charged by Troy were considered abusive by other kingdoms. This generated conflicts between kings and traders. In particular, the Mycenaeans were quite displeased, for they were a kingdom of proud warriors who considered the Trojans disrespectful. Troy was ruled by King Priam, who sent his son Paris on a diplomatic mission to Sparta to try to appease the situation with the Mycenaeans. Paris was marveled by Queen Helen, wife of King Menelaus. There are 2 versions of the story of Paris and Helen. One says that Helen was kidnapped by Paris. Another says that she would have left of her own free will with the young prince. King Menelaus was furious at the offense and asked his brother Agamemnon, who had the largest army in Greece, for help. Agamemnon identified the perfect opportunity to declare war on Troy and end this abusive tax collection. Agamemnon gathered his army and assembled a fleet of ships. According to Homer, the impressive array had more than 1,000 warships. King Agamemnon also called the legendary heroes Achilles and his group of warriors known as the Myrmidons. The Mycenaean army sailed the Aegean Sea and surrounded Troy, starting a war that would last almost 10 years. The Mycenaeans launched several attacks against the city, but all failed. In one of these attacks, Patroclus, a friend and lover of Achilles, was killed by Prince Hector of Troy. To avenge Patroclus' death, Achilles challenged Hector to one of the most famous duels in history. Homer describes an epic struggle. 2 of the greatest champions of his time fought to the death, near the gates of the city of Troy. Finally, Achilles delivered the fatal blow and killed Hector. Achilles, still furious at his friend's death, tied the feet of Hector's corpse to his chariot and made 3 laps around the perimeter of the city, dragging his body on the stony ground before all the Trojans. After this, the morale of the Trojans was extremely low, but even so, they did not surrender the city. Then the Mycenaeans conceived the plan of the famous Trojan horse. Using the wood of some of their ships, they built a great wooden horse and took it to the Trojan gates, where they put it as a gift for the Trojans, who had great esteem for horses. The Mycenaeans returned to their ships and faked their retreat. The Trojans, relieved to have escaped the siege, opened the gates and brought the wooden horse into the city and started a big party to celebrate the victory. Later at night, practically everyone in the city was plunged into an alcoholic sleep. At that moment, a hidden door in the belly of the wooden horse was opened. Out of it came Achilles and his warriors. The invaders easily killed the sleepy guards and opened the gates of Troy. The Mycenaean army, hiding behind some hills, finally managed to enter the city. The city was looted and burned. Practically all men were killed, including King Priam. The women and children were enslaved. According to the legend, Achilles died in Troy. wounded by a poisoned arrow that hit its heel, shot by the cowardly Paris. Other versions say that Achilles survived and headed to new battle and novels. The sordid Paris was killed that night. The Mycenaeans returned victorious to Greece, but many were punished by the gods and could never go home. King Menelaus took Helen back to Sparta, but after Menelaus' death, Helen was expelled from the city, having died alone in exile. One of the few survivors of the Trojans was the warrior Aeneas. According to the ancient Romans, he fled to Italy and gave birth to the Roman lineage. Much of this narrative comes from the poems of Homer. Although the works include gods, they are not entirely fictional. The evidence points to a real war in that region, and Troy was looted and burned. The texts written by the Hittites say that a people came from the sea and attacked the city of Troy. The texts of the Hittites also mention a Trojan prince named Alexandros, who may have been Paris or served as inspiration for him. Another possibility is that there are a new wave of seismic activities in 1300 BC, causing the decline of many civilizations. The siege of Troy will have happened in that period, and historians believe that part of the city wall fell due to an earthquake. The Mycenaeans camped outside the city did not suffer much damage and took advantage of the chaos to invade Troy. Coincidence or not, the god of the Mycenaeans was Poseidon, who was also the god of earthquakes. As such, from the point of view of the Mycenaeans, Poseidon helped them conquer Troy. The Trojan War told by Homer is a fantastic saga. Completely true or not, it traveled throughout the centuries, and to this day we use expressions, "beware Greeks bearing gifts," or Achilles' heel. Still, because of these earthquakes, many people migrated from one region to another, and many kingdoms completely failed. All these series of natural disasters, wars, and migrations caused the collapse of the Bronze Age. And, in Greece, a warrior people known as Dorians left Macedonia to conquer the cities of the Mycenaeans. The Dorians had equipment and weapons made of iron, which was an enormous advantage over the Mycenaeans, who still used bronze. After the fall of the Mycenaean kingdom, Greece entered a period known as the Greek Dark Ages, of which little is known. Slowly, it gave rise to classical Greece, making the Mycenaean civilization an important link in Western history. Many empires emerged during the Bronze Age. Some became famous as the Babylonians. Others, however, were buried by the sands of time and were almost forgotten in the course of history. The Hittite Empire was one of the most powerful and influential of its time, and yet it remained concealed for a long time. The Hittites were an Indo-European people who, in 2000 BC, settled in central Anatolia, where Turkey is today. They called themselves Hatti, and as soon as they arrived in the region, they dominated the other tribes. This domination was enforced. Diplomacy was only used when feasible. The Hittites were proud of their warrior society and had great esteem for horses. Those responsible for breeding and training horses had a prominent place in society. One of the first accounts of the Hittites is in the Greek tale The Odyssey, where the Hittites are called Ketas. In the Bible, the Hittites are quoted in the Old Testament as Heth. There is even the story of Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, who served King David. Uriah and Bathsheba were Hittites. The Hittites are also mentioned in Asian and Egyptian texts. Even with so many accounts, the Hittite people were only officially discovered in 1880 by archaeologist Archibald Henry Sayce. Even though he found evidence, Archibald was a laughingstock within academic society who said he was trying to make up the existence of the Hittites. Its discovery was only confirmed years later in excavations carried out by the German archaeologist Hugo Winkler. By 1650 BC, the Babylonian Empire, the Egyptian Empire, and the Hittite Empire had been consolidated. The Hittites were in a very privileged geographical position, since they could trade with different nations of different cultures. Merchant vessels from Greece, Egypt, and Mesopotamia passed through the ports of the Hittite cities. Even though they were surrounded by powerful kingdoms and empires, the Hittites were never conquered, and it is said they never lost a battle. In 1274 BC, the Hittites fought the Battle of Kadesh against the Egyptians. Both fought fiercely without gaining a decisive advantage. The The battle ended in a draw, and the powerful Egyptians were forced to retreat. Pharaoh Ramses II signed a peace treaty with the Hittites, recognizing the Hittite Empire as being of equal military power to Egypt. On several occasions, the Hittites stopped Assyrian, Babylonian, Egyptian, and Greek invasions, and even completely defeated the enemy troops. Their equipment consisted of bronze helmets and weapons, as well as heavy armor made of small bronze plates. The Hittites are also known as the first civilization to dominate iron metallurgy. The Hittites also had the reputation of owning the best war chariots of their time. They could carry 3 warriors and were pulled by 2 or even 4 horses. The tactic used by these carriages was efficient. There was a driver for the horses, a warrior with a long spear and heavy armor. Also, a third warrior carried a shield to protect the other 2. Sometimes, this third warrior used bow and arrows for attacks at a distance. A combination of speed, attack, and defense undoubtedly made the Hittites fearsome. Some records mention that even the famous city of Troy paid tributes to the Hittites. The Hittite society was incredibly advanced. They had their own hieroglyphic writing, later changed to the cuneiform writing copied from the Assyrians. They had a very detailed art style, as well as established and severe laws that punished with death crimes like murder. The capital city of the empire was Hattusa, whose ruins still exist today. In politics, there was the king, who showed social and military skills. Also, there was a council of noblemen called Penkus, which prosecuted the crimes or decided on minor day-to-day matters. Among the Hittites, even the slaves had rights in society. In religious matters, the Hittites were incredibly tolerant. They worshipped gods of various peoples and even respected the beliefs of their enemies, which earned the Hittites the epithet of people of the 1,000 gods. At its peak, the Hittite Empire extended from Turkey to a part of Lebanon and Syria. Shortly after the Battle of Kadesh, the Hittite Empire entered into eternal conflicts, and other peoples took advantage of this instability. The Hittites were destroying their cities and villages in the civil war. The Assyrians kept increasing the pressure with their attacks. The Hittite population began to flee from their homes and migrated to other regions. After burning Hattusa, their capital, the Hittites became easy targets for groups of pirates and looters. One of the most developed Bronze Age empires ended in ruins. As for the survivors of the Hittites, it is not clear where they went. Probably they lived in small tribes or sought refuge in cities of other kingdoms. Although so much time has passed, the Hittite Empire is still barely known and deserves to be remembered for its great historical importance. Much is said about the importance of Greek culture and how it has served as a basis for the development of Western thought. But the Greeks were influenced by others, ancient and exotic peoples, who are still a mystery to this day. The Phoenicians are among the most developed and influential peoples of antiquity. Their culture had a great impact on subsequent civilizations. The Phoenicians inhabited the coastal region of ancient Canaan, today the maritime coast of Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. In ancient times, they were known as the Purple People. The term Phoenicians comes from the Greek phonikes, which can mean crimson or purple, a color considered quite luxurious at the time. Around 1200 BC, Egypt lost some territories due to popular uprisings. The Phoenician culture started to flourish during that period. The power vacuum in the region allowed the Phoenicians to build their own trade routes and fortify their armies. Like the Sumerians and Greeks, the Phoenicians had many city-states. These remained independent with distinct cultural traits. With the development of a culture based on maritime trade, the Phoenicians came into contact with many different peoples, such as the Minoans of the island of Crete and the Mycenaeans in Greece. With the expansion of their domains, the Phoenicians colonized new territories. They founded important cities, among which Tyre, Sidon, and Beirut. One of the greatest contributions of the Phoenicians is related to writing. They created a model alphabet that is considered the ancestor of all modern ones. This alphabet is called the Phoenician phonetic alphabet. It reached Greece through the island of Crete. The Greeks, in turn, added the vowels to the Phoenician alphabet, creating the Greek alphabet. The Phoenicians thrived with the trade of wood, slaves, and glass, but their most valuable product was the Tyrian purple. The Tyrian purple is a natural dye extracted from sea snails. This dye is purple red, a color much appreciated by all the ancient nobility. But the value of the Tyrian purple was much more than the beautiful color. This dye did not fade from the garments with the passage of time. Instead, it became stronger and livelier. Another valuable source of income for the Phoenicians was high-quality wine. The Egyptians, for instance, could not grow grapes due to their hot climate. They paid in gold for the Phoenician wine jugs. The Phoenicians still traded in silver, copper, tin, and bronze, while also producing jewelry and sculptures made of colored glass. With so many different products in the markets, the Phoenicians accumulated a truly amazing wealth. All this was possible thanks to the incredible boats developed by the Phoenicians. The Phoenician galleys were called biremes, as they had 2 rows of oars. Other models with 3 rows were called triremes. This was the best type of ancient vessel. Its style was copied by the Greeks, Egyptians, and then by the Romans. The Phoenicians had a polytheistic religion. They worshipped a great number of gods and holy deities. Albeit having a sea-orientated culture, the Phoenicians did not seem to have sea deities. The Phoenicians also conducted animal sacrifices during religious festivals. This was very common at the time in practically all religions. However, the Phoenicians also sacrificed human beings, including children and newborns. Like the Minoans of the island of Crete, the Phoenicians had this duality. They were developed, but with an odd connection to primitive customs. The Phoenicians managed to travel awe-striking distances in the sea for their time. They sailed all along the coast of Africa, reaching the Iberian Peninsula, where today Spain and Portugal are located. It is believed that the Phoenicians also reached Great Britain and traded with the Celtic tribes there. 65 years before Rome was founded, the Phoenicians founded the Carthage in North Africa, a city that one day managed to terrorize Rome. There was a theory that the Phoenicians also crossed the Atlantic Ocean and reached the Brazilian Northeast. But this theory has already been cast aside and is considered an exaggerated fantasy. The Phoenicians are also often quoted in the Bible. The most famous is perhaps Princess Jezebel, daughter of King Ithobal of the city of Sidon. Jezebel became famous for marrying King Ahab of Israel, exerting much influence as queen and priestess. Even with all their fame and wealth, the Phoenicians did not have a unified military force. They could not offer much resistance against the attacks of the emerging Persian Empire. In 539 BC, Persia was ruled by King Cyrus II, known as Cyrus the Great, who conquered Phoenicia without much difficulty. Although the Phoenician cities were kept, many people moved to cities further away from Persian rule. Carthage was one of the main shelters. Its population grew substantially. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great conquered the Phoenician city of Tyre, at the time under Persian rule. Alexander was cruel, ordering the death of 2,000 citizens, among them Persians and Phoenicians. Shortly after, Phoenician culture disappeared from its country of origin. The ancient region of Phoenicia was then dominated by other powers such as the Greeks and Egyptians. Carthage continued to develop and prosper, creating its own cultural identity. Its citizens became known as Carthaginians. In essence, they maintained their Phoenician origin. The Bronze Age was responsible for several technological breakthroughs in ancient civilizations, allowing the emergence of great empires. Some of these empires became extremely rich and powerful, like the Babylonian, Egyptian, and Mycenaean empires, which dominated large territories for hundreds of years. At the time, nothing seemed capable of shaking these great military and economic powers. But, as the saying goes, history is written by the winners. Around 1259 BC, the world was experiencing a period of relative peace. The Egyptians, commanded by Pharaoh Ramses II, had signed a peace treaty with the Hittite Empire. which ended a war that lasted for many generations. Other powerful kingdoms followed similar examples, and for half a century, there were no great battles. Trade flowed between nations. The island of Crete was an outpost for many merchants, providing plenty of profit and prestige to the kingdom of Minoans. But everything would change, and the world would plunge again in a vortex of chaos and unprecedented violence. In a period that lasted about 40 to 50 years, the climate of the Earth suffered sudden changes. Although we do not have exact information, historians believe that there were several successive natural disasters, such as earthquakes, tidal waves, and volcanic eruptions. The Aegean islands suffered a great impact, with earthquakes and even tsunamis. Crete, once home to the legendary Minoan kingdom, was probably the most affected by this great cataclysm. Its cities were devastated by earthquakes and reduced to rubble. Climate changes also caused periods of drought in Egypt, Israel, Phoenicia, and part of Anatolia. All these natural disasters disrupted trade routes between the empires. Many, like the Kingdom of Mycenae in Greece and the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, went bankrupt, generating revolts and violence among the population. But something much worse happened afterwards. Climate change and the destruction of cities forced the migration of many different peoples who were looking for new regions to conquer and establish themselves. Large groups of pirates began to attack coastal cities, devastating everything that had resisted the earthquakes. These violent and bloodthirsty pirates were nicknamed Sea Peoples, being responsible for the fall of many powers of that time. The truth is that we do not know the original place of the Sea Peoples. It is highly likely that they were a confederation of tribes who, out of necessity or opportunism, united to attack a considerable part of the most powerful kingdoms in the world. The few contemporary sources left by the Egyptians and Hittites refer to the Sea Peoples by the name of Shurden, which may suggest that these pirates were from the islands of Sardinia and Sicily. Another hypothesis is that the Sea Peoples originate from the coastal tribes of western Anatolia, having organized themselves as a single horde to attack the continental kingdoms. The fact is that, at the end of the Bronze Age, the Sea Peoples attacked almost all the kingdoms that could be invaded by the sea. The Minoan kingdom, which was already very weakened, was an easy target for the pirates, who killed a good part of the island's inhabitants and destroyed the remaining cities. In Anatolia, the situation was not that different. The Hittite Empire, which was already quite fragmented, was shattered, even being completely extinguished due to the sudden attacks on the pirates. In Greece, the Mycenaean states suffered some attacks around 1190 BC, but they managed to get back on their feet for some time, collapsing definitively when they were invaded by the Dorians, a warrior people who dominated a substantial part of Greece. Egypt was one of the few empires that sustained the attacks of the Sea Peoples due to the enormous military skill of Pharaoh Ramses III, who expelled them definitively from his lands. The Assyrians were the least affected by the calamities. In a way, they were able to take advantage of the weakening of the neighboring kingdoms, further expanding their domains and beginning the Middle Assyrian Empire period. Although we know little about the Sea People, they had an enormous reputation as warriors and navigators already in antiquity. During the Battle of Kadesh, between the Egyptian and Hittite forces, the Shurden mercenaries were hired to fight for both sides, which proves that these coastal warriors were renowned. But not all the invaders of the Sea Peoples wanted only to plunder the decaying cities. There is a theory that some groups established permanent settlements on the coast of the ancient Canaan. The new inhabitants of the region became known as Philistines, a name well known in Old Testament biblical stories. Natural disasters caused the fragmentation and decay of the Bronze Age, but the Sea Peoples were responsible for the final blow to many empires. Another reason that made it impossible for the empires to recover was their highly centralized systems of government, where direct intervention by kings and emperors was necessary to solve all territorial issues. Because of the collapse of the Bronze Age, the world entered a kind of dark age, which we know little, but it was certainly turbulent and full of violence. New kingdoms were gradually organized during the Iron Age, with new models of government and armies composed mainly of well-equipped infantry. Around 750 BC, arts and writing began to resurface among the Mediterranean peoples. It is also during this period that the history of classical Greece and Rome begins. The Bronze Age had come to an end, and with it, an era of great discoveries, powerful empires, and legendary heroes, which become part of the history of the past. But it is important to remember that, without the Bronze Age, humanity would not have developed as we know it. We must be proud of the heritage left by our ancestors.